Thanks, Damon. I know this is going to be a complex rig and a lot of new stuff coming up in the new rig. So we're going to have to really be careful. We'll see how it pans out when the actual final process comes out. But I just make sure everyone understands there's going to be some changes for sure. Whether everything will go through on this point or not is up to how the comments go. So hopefully you all commented on the regulation. Anyway, so we'll go on to Kathy now. So Kathy is going to be presenting the material safe sampling plans, the LCR sampling plans, and the material survey plan. Okay, so that's going to be very important because you're going to have to identify these things. If you have, looks like an action level of 10 now parts per billion. That's going to be tough for you guys. So I'm glad I'm out of that. So anyway, so let's go on to Kathy. And Kathy is from the Western region, and she does the lead and copper for the Western region. So Kathy, you're all set.
Okay, thanks, Bob, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. As Bob said, I'm going to be talking about the planning part of the lead and copper rule requirements. So developing a lead and copper sampling plan and a material survey. And it looks like a lot of you have not had the pleasure of working on that. So hopefully after this, you will have a lot of your questions answered about how to go about doing the material survey worksheet. So this being DEP, we of course have an alphabet soup of acronyms. And here's a list of the ones we'll be using today. I think most of you are probably familiar with all of these, and I'll try to speak them out rather than use the acronyms, but these are the general ones that we'll be looking at today. So our learning objectives this morning, we want you to be able to understand that the forms that are required when you submit a sampling plan to MassDEP for review and approval. We want you to be able to identify when a lead and copper sampling plan requires a revision, to understand the purpose and importance of a material survey, to identify when to conduct a material survey, to understand what the tier and tier classifications are and how they differ for community and NTNC systems, to understand the steps that are required prior, during, and after submitting a lead and copper sampling plan to MassDEP for review and approval, and finally, to be able to properly fill out a lead and copper sampling plan and material survey worksheets. So that's our roadmap. So the first thing, this is really something that has to be done before the lead and copper sampling. All systems need to have an approved sampling plan on file prior to sampling. So that means that you can't really say, we did it last week and here's my list of where we did it from, and then expect it to be approved. It has to be approved beforehand. You should really make sure that you know that you're using the most current version of all forms. And the best way to do that is to use our website. We have a full list of all the most current forms, not just for lead and copper, for everything, but for this application for the lead and copper form. So I'm going to try to switch the screen here and show you what that looks like. So when you go to there we go. So when you go to our website and you go to the lead and copper forms, you're going to come up with a whole laundry list. And everything you can need will be on here. And we make changes as time goes on. People point out to us things that are unclear or not quite right, and we make changes to the forms. Some of the biggest changes recently had to do with the certification about lead service lines, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. But the point to remember is that always go here and always try to use the most current forms. A shortcut here is to use the lead and copper sampling checklist. That has the links to the forms. So if you have that handy, you have the the jumping off point for all the current forms. And pardon me as I learn how to negotiate all these different screens. All right, so you are planning to do your plan. You have the most current version of the forms. The next thing to do is the materials survey worksheet. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on why we do that and how we do that in a little bit. Again, have there been any changes in your system since the last sampling round? Do you have a new source? Do you have, did you change chemical manufacturers? Did you change chemicals for some of your treatment? All of these things are very important in evaluating your need to do lead and copper and the way you do lead and copper. It's always best to use our guidance. As I say, as from the last link, there are specific instructions walking you through how to do each of the forms that we're talking about. Again, this should be your guiding principle really. Is the sampling pool, do you have a good picture of your sampling pool, and are you targeting the highest risk sites? We're looking for the sites that have the highest likelihood of having elevated lead or copper. So that's really the goal. It's an exposure-based concern. What are people drinking? Are we looking at the worst possible case situations? And again, before you begin, have you made contact with all the participants? You can come up with a great list of high tier sites, but if you haven't made those connections and made sure that there's still someone in the house and they're still willing to participate, you know, that's the stuff that you really have to make sure you have organized before you start. I'll just touch really briefly on, you know, sort of the why of all this. Why are we concerned about lead in drinking water? Well, obviously it's because of the health effects. Where are the sources? Very rare to have a source be the problem of lead. Naturally occurring lead is not an issue out here. It's really a distribution system concern. So this graphic sort of nicely walks through all the different places where your wonderful water that you've worked so hard to produce and distribute can get contaminated with lead on its way to the people in the homes that are drinking it. So at the connection from the from the water main, you can have lead service lines. So the pipe running from the main to the home, there was a period of time where lead service lines were commonly used, and a lot of you are still dealing with that. So that is a major source of lead contamination, either a lead service line or a lead line service line. Also right at the connection, even if the actual line to the home is not lead, if it's connected with a lead gooseneck or pigtail, these shorter connections, flexible connections that were so convenient to use, that connect the lead service line to the main, or connect the main to the service line, can be another source. Fixtures in the house may certainly contain lead. Fixtures from several years ago that might have even been labeled as lead-free were allowed at some point to contain a fairly high concentration of lead, and that what's acceptable to be called lead-free has changed over time, and the EPA has some very nice graphics and explanations about how to figure that out. But again, most homes, you know, the housing stock is fairly old in Massachusetts in a lot of places, and so you may have fixtures that are adding to lead contamination within the home. If you have galvanized pipe, lead particles can have attached to the surface, and over time, they can enter the drinking water, causing elevated lead. And lastly, in terms of chronologically, copper pipe that was used with lead solder was legal until 1986, and we know that that lead solder can be a source of lead in the homes. So our tier classification system is, the current one is set up acknowledging those as higher tier sites. So how many lead and copper samples are required? Well, it's based on population. So depending on the size of your system, how many people you serve, that will determine the number of sites that are needed for lead and copper sampling. So standard monitoring is what you start off with and what you go back to if you have any problems related to lead or copper action level exceedances. And the reduced monitoring is what you can achieve if you have optimized corrosion control or a long record of not having any problems. And you can see they drop by half according to this, unless you're under 100, which it stays at 5 either way. So we use the greater population. You might have a higher winter population or a higher summer population or the same, but whatever is the highest that's reported on your annual statistical report, that will determine the number of samples that are required. You're responsible for telling MassDEP if you cross a threshold. So if you are an expanding community and you are adding connections on and you jump from one of these levels to the next, yes, we might catch it on the ASR, but it's your responsibility as operators to note when you're approaching and when you might go over some of these and change either. Usually it's going up once I've seen it go down in terms of population. So again, this is the regulatory requirement for the number of samples that you're taking. So what are the tiers in the tier classifications? Tiering is a way to prioritize sampling locations based on risk. So the goal here is for you to be sampling the locations that have the highest risk of elevated lead or copper. So every sampling location must have a tier assigned, and EPA has identified 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3. And for some sites that don't meet the tier criteria, there's a special one called 3H for community systems. And then within each tier, the tiers are further broken down, classified with 1A, 1B, et cetera, 2D. This is within the community system. And for community systems and NTNCs, there are different tier classifications. Now, this is the reason why almost every form that we have that involves you to write in a clear tier classification, we put a little reference chart on it, because it's not something that you'd expect anyone to just remember the difference between a 1B2 and a 2E. So, but in general, the tier hierarchy is tier 1s are higher tier than 2 and 3. So the goal is to have as many high tier 1 sites for sampling as possible. So your goal in this planning portion is to come out with a characterization of all your connections, to know what you have for a sampling pool, and then to do your very best, your due diligence, to get those highest tier locations be the ones that you're actually sampling. All right, so you have probably seen this if you filled out a lead and copper sampling plan. This is the sort of summary sheet here for community systems that explains the different classifications. So within the tier 1 classification, there are 5 different possible classifications. 1A being single family residences with lead service lines or lead line pipes. So those lead service lines can be partial or full. That's the highest tier, the most high risk locations are tier 1As. Following that would be 1A2s. In systems where 20% of your connections are multifamily residences, you can use these multifamily residences for sampling. Those would be multifamily residences with lead service lines, or tier 1A2s. Tier 1A3s are single family residences with lead goosenecks or pigtails. 1B are single family residences with lead service pipes or copper pipes with lead and tin solder, built between 1983 and 1985. The idea here is those were the final years where the use of lead tin solder was legal. And so the expectation is that they would be the most likely to still be leaching, as opposed to lead service lines with lead, or regular lines with lead tin solder that were built even longer ago than that. And finally, in the tier 1 class would be the tier 1B2. Those are single family residences with verified lead tin solder built later than 86. So we acknowledge that while you're not obliged to go and search these out. It comes up occasionally. Obviously, plumbers finished what was using the material on the truck, and so there's clearly some residences that have lead tin solder, even though they were built later than 86. So after tier 1, we go to tier 2. These are, in the case of tier 2C, multifamily residences with lead service lines and or goosenecks or pigtails made of lead. Tier 2D were multifamily residences with either lead or copper pipes with lead tin solder built 83 to 85. Tier 2E, private buildings with lead service lines and or lead goosenecks or pigtails. What's a private building? That could be a commercial building, a municipal building, not a residential building, but one that you're serving and that meets these criteria. And then finally for tier 2, tier 2F, private buildings with lead pipe or copper pipe with lead tin solder installed between 83 and 85. So the lowest tier sites, the least likely to have elevated lead, are tier 3s, which would be single family residences built prior to 83, and the exceptional cases. So this might be a case of something like, built in 95 with all plastic pipes, something like that. That would fall into the 3H. And there's a location on the second page of the form that explains, that asks for you to give that little explanation of why it's a 3H. For NTNCs, we don't have the subclassifications, but we do have tiers 1, 2, and 3. So there's no classifications. Tiers that contain copper pipes with lead solder installed after 82, or have lead pipes and or are served by a lead service line. Those all fall into tier 1 for NTNCs. Tier 2 for NTNCs are buildings that contain copper pipes with lead solder installed before 83, and tier 3 is everything else. So if you need additional sites to complete your sampling pool, the NTNC system should just use sites representative of the distribution system. And that's defined as a site where the plumbing materials used at the site would commonly be found at other sites served by the water system. So there's no subclassification, no A, Bs, and Cs for NTNCs. So for a little pause here, I'm going to ask that the first poll question be rolled out so we can so you can take a check of what we've been talking about. So explain the hierarchy of sampling location tiers in a lead and copper sampling plan. So choose the best answer. A is tier 1 sampling locations are at a higher risk of elevated lead or copper. B is tier 3 sampling locations are at a higher risk of elevated lead or copper. And C is a sampling locations tier is not related to the risk of elevated lead or copper. So go ahead and choose what you think is the best answer. Do we have any questions through the chat that would be appropriate to talk about now?
Yes, we do have a number of people put in a question about, are the slides themselves going to be available on the DEP website? Yes, they will be posted on the website as a PDF, so no one can change anything on the PDF, and they'll be there. And also the recording of the whole program that we're doing today will be on the website. So those will be available. Okay, I got one other question. Okay. A single family resident, this is to you now, Kathy. A single family resident with a lead service from a gate box to a meter box that's not an lead and copper sample site. Who is financially responsible for its replacement if the owner wants it replaced? That's an ownership issue.
Yeah, that's an ownership issue, which I am going to give over to Boston. Someone from the Boston office to deal with that.
Now, I think there are going to be, there will be some grants that are going to be coming through on this. So obviously that's one of the things that's going to come up with lead service lines especially.
Yeah, is Yvette on the line?
No, she's on vacation.
Is Damon still on?
Damon should be. No, he said he had to go off.
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the grants programs that are available, but certainly that would be something that we'd encourage you to look at to see if it would be appropriate for your system.
I would say this, being from a water supply system, there are who owns what is pretty well defined by the water department. Okay, so they know who's responsible, and if it's your service line, this customer is going to be responsible. But I know MWRA has done an awful lot of financing of 0% interest financing for lead line service replacements. So it depends where you are.
Yeah, and we also can send the information about the SRF lead service line replacement program after, where they will, the program allows you to let the residents to change the part of the lead service line at no extra cost. So we can send that information after.
I think that's the last of the questions.
Okay.
So it looks like we got the most of the people in.
Great. So 96% said that tier 1 sample locations have higher risk of elevated lead or copper. That's absolutely right. That's the big broad picture here. So I'm glad that you are all caught that. So it looks like our polling is going pretty.
Yeah, remember on this polling,
Clearly.
This is required for your TCHs, everyone.
All right. As the poll's closed, I believe, right?
Yep.
All right. So let's move along. To the part that fewer people are familiar with. There were a lot of material surveys done, I think, in the 90s, from which your initial lead and copper sampling locations were based. But this is the update here. So all public water suppliers have to complete a material survey worksheet of their system to identify their pool of sample sites. So this is something that's really giving you a snapshot, a picture of your system and your connections as they are now and how they relate to whether or not a location should be sampled for lead and copper. So these material survey worksheets need to be completed before you start sampling for lead and copper. And you need to start early. This is not something you can do in an afternoon or even in a couple days. This is a pretty major effort, and we acknowledge that. But as you heard about the upcoming anticipated changes for the lead and copper rule on the federal level, this work that you do now is going to be required very soon. So it's going to be work that's done and will be useful to you later. So it's not sort of done as a one-off here. It's something that you're really going to use quite a bit in the future. So every system has to fill out a material survey worksheet, but you only need to submit it with your sampling plan if your sampling plan has sites other than tier 1 sites. So everyone needs to do this, but whether or not we actually need to see it depends on what your pool looks like on your lead and copper sampling plan. You do it and you must have it. We can ask you for it, and certainly EPA during an audit would ask you for it. You know, well, how did you come up with this lead and copper sampling plan? Where did you decide to pull these sampling locations from? So with these proposed revisions coming up, all water suppliers are going to be required to submit it. The material survey worksheet should be constantly updated every sampling round to ensure that you are using the highest tier sites on your sampling plan. So things change. You have lead service line replacements. People put in whole house filters, which would take them off of the list. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And I've certainly seen quite a few systems that once they go back and someone else looks at the information they have in their records, you know, they find higher tier sites that they didn't have on the list before. So it's really a dangerous thing to basically just rely on something that was done in the 90s. You really need to, you're going to be signing it and as being certifying that it's true. And so you really need to be sure that you have done a full look through of all of your system information before you sign on the line, that you are, you know what you have. So we really recommend that you think about this material survey worksheet as a living document, that you keep track of these changes over time. And it's really good to assign someone specifically to this task. I can't tell you how many phone calls I get that say, well, so-and-so used to do this, but you know, whatever, he moved here or he's doing something else now. And now I'm the lead and copper person and I don't really get this. Or, you know, it's really important to have good documentation and to make this lead and copper sampling plan something that is assigned to someone in particular. So we do have a very good description. I'm going to change the screen here and try to show you what that looks like. So the material survey is not just the worksheet. It actually comes with a very extensive set of instructions on it. And this is what it looks like. So you've got a full several page set of instructions, a list of, we'll talk about these sources of information, but it lists all the different sources where you should be able to find information to help you complete it. It gives you instructions about how to choose the sampling sites within it. It walks through each of the different worksheets. So this is a really good tool that you have. I think it was also sent to you as part of your package before this morning's webinar started. So it's, in general, there's just always a very good instructions on our website as references for you to go back and to use as you go ahead and work on your plans. Okay. So you're going to be figuring out the status of all your connections. Not a small task. We acknowledge, especially those of you from large systems, that this is a major undertaking. And a lot of you have good starts on this already. And some of you have done recent material surveys, so you've done a lot of this work already. So the first sheet here is going to be where you list the basic information. What you need to find out all the information about all your connections, but what you're going to submit on these material worksheets is the number of locations that you're proposing for sampling. So for example, if you have to do 40 locations, you're going to have enough copies of this investigation worksheet number 1 to fill in 40. We don't want to see all 3,500 of all this detailed information. But it's important that you have all the specifics for the particular ones that you're going to be sampling. So type of structure, this would be single family or multifamily residence or private building. The location is the address, name, and phone number or email of the contact person. This is it's usually the owner. You'd be calling or emailing to see if they're interested in being part of the sampling program. Do they have a lead service line? What kind of home plumbing material do they have? And was the material verified? So this verification really falls in if you are talking about lead tin solder that was put in after '86 that might have been verified. Or if you took your record from an observation during a repair, you could have verified at that point, perhaps a pigtail or or lead tin solder, that sort of information. Did the owner volunteer? Were they selected either as a routine or an alternate? And did they receive the training material? That would be the chain of custody with all the instructions about the expectations for not using for a period before the sampling was done. So again, these lists here, this worksheet 1, you're going to fill out for each of the locations that's either on your primary or your alternate list, not for everyone in your distribution system. And I want to call your attention down here saying, if you are required to submit this form, you have to do this certification. My signature below indicates that I have provided MassDEP with a material survey. I certify under penalty of law that I am the person authorized to fill out this form, and the information contained herein is true, accurate, and complete to the best of my knowledge and belief. So this is really a significant thing here. You are attesting to the accuracy of whatever you're using as the basis for your lead and copper sampling plan. So I can't stress enough in these post-Flint days that the need for accountability about what you're sampling, where you're sampling and why you chose those places to sample. The second sheet is is not just reflective of what you are proposing for sampling, but of your entire system. So here, when you have single family, multifamily, public or commercial buildings and totals, here we're talking about your whole system, not of, say, the 40 or the 20 that you're required to sample. And this is broken out based on the characteristics of the building. Number of residences or building with lead pipes would be in this column. Copper pipes with lead solder built before 83. Copper pipes with lead solder built between 83 and 85. Buildings with verified lead solder built after 85. And then if you have lead service line connections, the number that would go in either in full lead service lines or partial lead service lines. You'll notice there's not a place specifically, there's not a column specifically for goosenecks and pigtails, but we ask that you make some note of that. So you might put partial lead line, and if they're all, if some percentage of those, or you have 300 of those and 200 are lead goosenecks, you would, make some kind of a note on that. We've hesitated to revamp this entire form because we know there's a change coming this year, so it didn't seem like it made sense to revamp it now and then revamp it again once the federal regs come in. Again, there's a certification on this one. So this is the picture of your entire system on worksheet 2. And on worksheet 3, this is basically the same information as on worksheet 2, but it's just asked for in a different orientation. So it's basically the same information, but the kind of residences are across the top rather than in part of the rows. So that's it. It doesn't look like much, but it takes a lot of work to pull together. But again, it's definitely something that is going to be required for you soon. And the sooner you get going on this, the better, if you haven't already. I know a lot of systems have already been working hard on this, and some have come up with very complete things. Now, you may want to have your own spreadsheets for your own purposes that lists all your connections and whether they have, what kind of indoor plumbing they have that would characterize them for this material survey. You may want to add some columns onto an existing spreadsheet that you have. But what we ask is that you then take the information from your big picture from the full system and work it down into these spreadsheets to give us this information. So how do you go about doing this? You need to look at all your records that document the materials that are used to construct and repair the distribution system. So different systems have different setups for documentation. Some have better documentation than others. Some have more complete documentation than others. It's not necessarily a function of how big you are. Some small systems have really excellent documentation. Some bigger systems have had to upgrade to get the information they needed. So these are typical things that you can look through. Your service line tie cards. often might have a note about whether or not there's a gooseneck or a pigtail as a connector. Looking at building permits. So that's going to help you know what was constructed when, what was constructed within that 83 to 85 time frame, what came after, what came before. Your plumbing codes and your plumbing permits. Your distribution maps and drawings are going to tell you where are my plastic lines, where are my galvanized lines, you know, where would I be more likely to find lead lines. Your inspection and maintenance records, very critical. That's the place to look to see whether or not someone made a note about materials when they were doing inspections or repairs. Meter installation records, permit files, and very important to talk to the people who've been around for a while, the senior personnel within your group, buildings inspectors, and call some retirees, you know, if it's like, what happened on that street there? You know, we know there was some reconstruction, but the notes aren't so good. If those people are still alive and around, please try to utilize them and get your records up to date. So when you're filling out the material survey worksheets, remember that the worksheet 1 applies to the primary and alternative sampling locations, not to every connection. Although you need to know about every connection in order to fill it out, we don't need to see every piece of information about every connection. Worksheet 2 are the materials survey results by the number of service connections for each plumbing type. And worksheet 3 is the summary of the material survey results. You need to fill out all 3. Now you'll notice that there are some, when you fill out sheet 3, you're not going to necessarily come out with the total number of service connections that you have. So you can submit supplemental information to sort of fill in those gaps, to explain to us how you got to where you did on those sheets. Some, you know, for smaller systems, some people just submit their whole database, if it's not enormous, that has everything about everything. But you might just want to say, well, these are the number that don't fit into any of these categories. And when you add up what I have on worksheet 3 with these that don't fit in any categories, you arrive at my total number of service connections for my system. So you're gonna make sure that you do all the additions that are required. When you fill out the forms. We'll go through a couple examples in a minute here, so how you can tell that you're on the right track. So you're going to give what you're going to end up with from these worksheets is the total number for each tier class, which is then what you will use as the sampling pool to target the highest risk sites based on trying to get the most tier 1 sites as possible. So here's an example. It's a little harder to see probably, but you can see in red here. Well, you can see that we filled in what tiers you're going to end up with. So for example, single family residences that have lead pipes, that's going to go into your tier 1 pool. Residences with copper pipes and lead solder built before 83, that's part of your tier 3 pool. And as we go on and on here. So basically you'll see your tier 1s are going to draw from your residences with lead pipes, lead service lines, partial lead service lines. Your tier 2s then are going to be your multifamily residences that draw from those. And then so this, you can just use this sort of as a reference to see where these connections get made between this sheet and then your lead and copper sampling plan. So any service connections after 85 that are not verified lead solder and not listed in this table doesn't show here. So this is not, that's why your totals here is not going to be your total number of service connections. You'd have to add in those other locations to make that come. So don't worry about the fact that your, put all your totals in here doesn't add up to your number of service connections. And also just another note, as I mentioned already, that pigtails and goosenecks don't have a spot on the form. But if you could just note somewhere, for example, out of your lead connections, how many of the number you list are actually from pigtails or goosenecks. If you're doing this for an NTNC, we're not talking about single family residences or multifamily residences. So these first two rows here don't really apply for NTNC systems. Here you're talking about buildings, and your tier 1 is going to draw from whether or not it's got lead connections, lead tin solder, verified lead tin solder, or lead lines. So somewhat simplified for NTNCs when you're filling out these forms. So what are some of the common mistakes that we see on these material surveys? One is that the total number of sites equal to the number of samples required rather than the number of service line connections in the whole system. So as I mentioned, that first page is really just for the number of samples that you're going to be taking. So we don't want to see all the service connections on the first worksheet. No signature, that's probably a common problem for just about any form. If it doesn't have a signature, it's not certified, that information's not certified, and we can't accept that. So make sure that you sign what you submit. So what do these numbers mean, and where do you go from here? So you've got your material survey done. You've identified the number of high-risk sites that should be either included or evaluated as part of your lead and copper sampling plan. Do you have a sufficient number of tier 1 sites to complete your plan? So if you need to do 20 locations and you only have 10 tier 1 sites, you're going to have to include a copy of this material survey worksheet with your lead and copper sampling plan. If you have enough tier 1 sites, you have to do this material survey. You have to know that you're drawing from, that the information you have is good, that you're drawing from a pool that is reflective of what you actually have, but you do not need to send it in to us, because you'll be signing on the line saying I have all tier 1 sites, and that's all you'll need to do. So again, if you are submitting a lead and copper sampling plan that has anything other than tier 1 sites on it, you would need to submit with it a copy of your material survey worksheets. Remember that your material survey worksheets need to be updated when you've had changes in your distribution system. So are you doing lead service line replacement before your sampling round? Your material survey worksheet should reflect the change there in the number of lead service lines that you have, because you should be having fewer. Has someone done a complete, I mean, I've often seen, whatever, someone's done a complete rehab, redid every bit of plumbing in the house. That could change someone from a tier 1B to a tier 3, because that building, that address no longer, the way you had it in your previous material survey sheet no longer reflects reality, right? If they've taken out if they've put in all new piping. So your material survey is a constantly evolving document. So it's something that you have to revisit every time you get ready to do a sampling round. That might be every year, every 3 years, or at least every year if you're doing it semi-annually. So think of it as something that's always going to be changing. And once you get a framework set up for you to keep track of your information, it really won't be as onerous. You won't be like repeating it from scratch every time. You'll just be revising it as you go. So let's move to the next poll question to see, for a little pause and to check in for questions and see what you took from this section on material surveys. Can we launch the next poll question, please? So material survey worksheets, pick the best answer. Are they A, completed once for every public water supply system? B, they include only the number of locations required for lead and copper rule sampling? Or C, are updated continuously before every round to ensure that the highest risk locations are identified for sampling? So choose what you think is the best answer, and looks like there's quite a bit in the chat. do we have some questions that we could talk about here?
Okay, yeah, Kathy, we have one about if I have all tier 1 sites and I know my service lines are all copper because of building records, do I need to have a material survey?
Well, you need to have one on file. We wouldn't need to see it in that situation. But for example, if your system was chosen for an audit by EPA, it would be very likely that they would ask to see your material survey to see that basically they would say, you know, what did you base your choice of lead and copper sampling plan locations on? So you don't have to submit it to us in that case, but it does need to be done and on file and available at request of either the state or the feds.
Okay, another one was on private wells to a residence home. That is not a public water supply, so we have no responsibility on private wells. So that's where that's going to fall out. Now, whether you as a homeowner can get grants, that's another whole thing. So, but it's, remember, DEP and EPA only are responsible for public water supplies. Okay, so next one would be, how do we know a lead service line was installed before, was it 85? I think it is. So that's again,
A lead service
records, line? Right?
Yeah, being records. It would seem, yeah, I mean, you're depending on your records for all of these issues. I mean, sometimes you can check them, you can look, you know, if you're doing a repair, if you have a main break and it's near a service line and, you know, you could see whether, you know, whether it was there, but yeah, you'd have to go on your records.
Okay, another one I have is from Andy Durham about brass. He has brass service lines. How do they fit into the rating system? Not brass service line, brass house lines in the home.
Brass. So the line.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, they're not lead, so I guess they wouldn't be called lead. I would note that as they don't really fall into the categorization.
Right, they're not copper and they're not lead.
Yeah, they're not copper and they're not lead, so.
Yeah, but brass contains, you know, what, 8% lead? I was out in the 1990s, I was out in Melrose and there was a house we went into. There was a lead poisoned infant and, you know, the house had brass throughout, plumbing, the whole house was brass. And, you know, it's 8% lead.
Yep. Obviously, that should be if you're doing a material safety, a material survey just listed as it would be listed as brass line as opposed to copper or lead.
Yeah, I would just mark it as that.
Okay, the other question I have is due to COVID-19, we are unable to enter residence. How do we get this information if we can't go in the house?
Well, you're doing it based on the information you have. The material survey is not, there's no expectation that you're going to be, you know, entering and verifying everything for every connection. So you'd be doing it based on what you have. There's no expectation that you'd be inspecting every connection. That would be sort of an insurmountable effort.
Okay, so I think that's all the question. There is one by Paul Anderson, and if you want to further define this one, I'll have questions and answers at the end. So I think Jessica's probably talked to you about that one.
So it looks like 88% of people have voted. If ever, you know, okay, so it just looks like we closed the poll. So great. 94% of you are correct in saying that the material survey worksheets are updated continuously before every sampling round to ensure that the highest risk locations are identified. Great. Okay, thank you. All right, now we'll move on to actually filling out the lead and copper rule sampling plan forms. All systems have to have an approved sampling plan on file. Let me close this. Okay. So water suppliers that have submitted a lead and copper sampling plan that didn't have a lead service line certification block. So in 2018, we put in a certification section there. It's a checkbox that basically says, I don't have any lead service lines. Check if this applies. This is really critical because that's really the highest risk locations. So it's really important that your sampling plan certifies that. So, I mean, there are a lot of old lead and copper sampling plans floating around. And I know it's frustrating to fill out a form, especially for like a little NTNC with 5 locations, and they're the same 5 locations and nothing's changed. And we're bugging you to, you know, just to fill it out on a new form. I know that's frustrating, but it's really important for this lead service line certification. So please be sure that you do this. Now, you may need a new sampling plan for other reasons. If you've done a change in treatment, if your population has gone from one threshold to another, if you've got a change in source, or you've had to change your sampling frequency, either an increase because you've had an action level exceedance, or a decrease because you say you had a new source and you've sampled for a while and there's no problem and you want to go back to reduced sampling, all those are possible reasons why you might need to do a lead and copper sampling plan change. So I'm gonna just bring up a copy of the of what the sampling plan looks like. So at the top we have just basic PWS identification information, phone, etc., population, samples required, whether you're on a standard plan or a reduced plan for monitoring. Here you're going to have your tier, which would be 1, 2, or 3. And if you are a community system, then you would also have A, B, C, etc. in the tier class. The sample site address. We ask that you get this correct, because there are roads and lanes and circles that have the same street name. So make sure that it's absolutely identified. The location, kitchen or bathroom, this would come from your contact with the homeowner or the building owner to see what you're going to be using and who is going to be collecting the sample. Most often for the lead and copper rule, it's going to be the homeowner or the residence. Occasionally it might be the PWS, especially for an NTNC perhaps that operates its own water, this facility operates its own water supply. Lab occasionally, though I haven't seen it very often. So you'll note that there are 15 here. That works for you if you've got 5 or 10. If you're in the 20 to 40 to 60 range, you're going to have to use the next sheets that have additional ones. We'll talk about schools in a little bit. Here's the certification block, the lead service line certification block I mentioned before. This box, if you send this in and you don't check this box and you're not listing any lead service lines in your tiers or tier classifications, we'll send it back and say, so, you know, you have to check this box if it's appropriate. Again, your certification, your authorized signature, email, title, etc. And then here's your handy reference table here in one spot that for both community systems with all the definitions and then for the NTNC systems. So you'll send that to us, we'll review it, we'll approve it or not, might make a comment, and then the second page has to do with if you need continuation. So depending on how many locations you need, you may need more of these. This box here, other exceptional cases or comments, this is the case for 3H. You know, say you have an NTNC that was built with all plastic pipe in 2002, that's where you'd say, you know, facility built in 2002 with all plastic pipe. That explains why you have the tier that you do on the other page. All right, alternative sites. We strongly, strongly recommend that you get a good pool of alternative sites. And the biggest advantage to having these alternative sites is that in many situations, if you have a pre-approved alternative sites that meet certain criteria, you will not have to recontact MassDEP to use an alternative site. So the criteria are listed here when you can use another site without prior approval. First of all, if the primary site was not greater than the action level during a previous sampling round it was sampled, and the alternative site is at the same or higher tier than the primary site. So for example, you have a tier 1B site, and it had very low levels last time, and they have relocate, the owners have gone to Florida for 3 months or whatever. They're not there to take it, or they don't want to take it. There's a new owner that doesn't want to take the samples, doesn't want to participate. If you have another tier 1B pre-approved on this list, you just use it. You do not need to get back in touch with the department. So it's a real advantage for you to have a good robust list here. So we recommend that if you have 10, that you have 10 or 15 alternatives. Really, if you're doing this work up front to get people on board, it really makes sense to have a nice full alternative list. It gives you a lot of flexibility. All right, and then we continue on to more alternative sheets. Here, for community systems that have schools or early education care facilities, you need to list out all the schools, whether they're a school or an early education facility, where they previously sampled, and when you plan to sample next. Now, the requirement in our state regs, and soon to be in the federal regs, it sounds like as well, is that you collect samples from at least 2 schools or early childhood facilities for a total of 4 samples. So 2 samples, usually a kitchen and a bubbler fountain, from each of 2 schools or facilities. You're going to focus on school-age childcare. There's not a strict cutoff on the number of children that are being cared for, but we ask that you look for these school-age childcare. And some larger systems are going to need more than 1 sheet for this. So I will walk you through how to get yourself a list of those in a little bit, but that is a requirement. So you're going to choose sites that are the highest tier available. It's a site that's defined as a potential for exposure to excessive levels of lead or copper. So those are going to be lead service lines, full or partial, lead goosenecks or pigtails, or using 50-50 solder. Again, the sampling pool is going to go in the order of high to low risk. The regs say that you need at least, if you have lead service lines, that at least 50% of your tier 1 sites have to be lead service line sites. We recommend that if you have to take 20 locations and you have 20 lead service line locations, that you take them all, use them all. All right, then other tier 1 sites, then tier 2, then tier 3. So that's the hierarchy that we've been talking about. This is just, we've already gone through this. So highest priority to lead service line, single family residences, then multifamily residences with lead service lines, then single family residences with lead goosenecks or pigtails, then your lead tin solder in the 83 to 85 range, and then 1B2s are single family residences with verified lead tin solder built after 86. No, EPA is not requiring you to search out illegally installed lead tin solder, but if it comes up, you notice it as part of some work at a location, or if a homeowner contacts you thinking they might have it, and you check it out and it is, those can be used. Again, the tier 2, we've run through this, multifamily with lead service line, higher priority than lead tin solder, higher priority than private buildings with lead service lines or gooseneck pigtails, and then private buildings with 83 to 85 lead solder. Tier 3 sites for communities, 3G built before 83, 3H. So these are obviously residences would still be preferable to non-residences. Here's a reference to brass faucets. So PWS only has plastic plumbing, but cannot demonstrate lead-free conditions because of brass faucets. Again, use that little comment form on the second page of the first form for the sampling plan to clarify what that 3H means. So tier 1 buildings for NTNCs, again, tier 1, higher risk than tier 2 or tier 3. Tier 1 sites are your copper pipes with lead solder installed after 82, or contain lead pipes, or are served by a lead service line. Tier 2 sites consist of buildings that are contain copper pipes with lead solder installed before 83, and tier 3 is basically everything else. So when you're filling in these forms, use the greater number for the population, whatever you've used on your most recent ASR. You're going to use the LCR SPA for primary sample sites. Don't forget the certification block. SPB is the alternative sites. If possible, we'd like you to list 1 to 1.5 times the required number of primary sites. That's really for your convenience. I mean, sometimes people say, oh, I just need to get going and I didn't have time to do all those. It usually comes back to bite you that you're going to have to do that extra work to find those extra places, because it's a rare round where everyone is available and willing on your primary list. And then your SBC for the date of the school. So we'll go into a little more detail about the schools. So you have to list all your schools, and we acknowledge that for some of you really large systems, you have a lot of schools and you have a lot of early education childhood facilities. There's a really great tool for locating these early education childhood facilities. I was hoping to get this up, but I might just have to share a screenshot of it. Well, maybe it'll come up. So this is going to give you a list. You can search by your location. Oh, let's see if I can share that. So in a situation like here, so what you can get from this search from the early education childhood group in Boston is a list of everyone who's licensed, and you can search by town and the kind of program you're looking for. So here under program type, if you don't change anything, you'll get everything, but we ask you to focus on group and school age childcare. That's going to give you the, it's not going to give you every family daycare, someone that can take up to 6 kids. So, and then you can just select a city or town. Let's pick Agawam in Western region. So now you've picked group and school age, you've picked your town. Now, not to say some towns have different addresses served by different water companies, or not everyone's on a, you may get addresses that you do not serve. So that will be, you'll have to double check that, but this will give you the full list. Then you just hit search and it will come up with a list here of everyone that meets those criteria. So in this case, these are school programs that are in aftercare programs in some schools. If you go, say, for example, to a nursery school. Oh, I'm also going to point out too that these guys are pretty up to date. So they are marking ones that have been reopened since COVID. So that might be useful to you, though. I would suggest that you're going to put everybody on your list, and then you're going to make the calls or try to find out whether or not they're actually operating. So if you click on this particular preschool, it'll tell you, what the capacity is. They're 8 to 4:30. So not to say that they're operating, because these change, and not to say that they're at this exact address, because sometimes people reopen businesses in different locations. So it's just a very, very nice tool here for you to use. Again, you're going to, start with your town and start with group childcare, and it'll give you your list that you need to start working from. As I said, you should focus on school-age childcare programs, and you're going to rotate through your list, targeting the most vulnerable populations. So if there are some that have younger kids or more kids, those would probably rise to the top of your list. Each round, you're going to do 2 taps at each of 2 schools. If you happen to have, this has come up a few times, a childcare facility that really only has one tap that they use for kids, then you would have to get a second facility to make a total of 4. So your goal is always 4. It's usually done 2 taps at each of 2 schools. Can you do more than this? Of course you can. And I think some systems, especially if they don't have a whole lot of schools, it's hard to explain why someone has to wait 3 years for the school on the other side of town to get sampled. You know, you can have a more proactive program than this. So you can certainly do more than this, but this is the requirement from the regulations. All right, so you filled out your sampling plan and you're ready to submit it to MassDEP. So you have to certify that if you don't have tier 1 sites, you have to be giving us a materials survey. You're certifying that you comply with 310 CMR 2206B7, and that's just the part of the lead and copper state regs that lists that has all the requirements for lead and copper sampling. So it includes everything about where to take them and how many you take. So it's just saying you're complying with the regs. Now, if you have higher tier sites in your distribution system that you are not using on your form, you have to submit there's one other form that you have to do, and it's called the highest tier form. And I'll show you what that looks like. Here we go. So this is a fairly new form. Some of you, especially if you haven't done this in 3 years, may not have seen this before. So if you're a community system and you're submitting a lead and copper sampling plan that has locations other than tier 1, you just have to make sure that you have tried to get the highest tier sites. So you're going to have to fill out this information. So you looked at your whole system. Say that you identified some additional higher tier sites that are not on your plan. You tried to contact them. You sent letters, you made emails, you did calls. And what this section here does is document your attempts to get these higher tier sites online. So for example, maybe you sent 10 letters or whatever to different places. 5 of them responded, and 5 didn't respond. And of those 5, 3 said they would do it and 2 declined participation. So this is your certification that I tried to reach everyone that was higher tier than what is on my plan. And this is my certification that I couldn't get them involved. So it's really important for you that you keep this documentation. You have to certify this, send this in along with your plan if your plan doesn't have all high tier sites. So if you have some higher tier sites, say for example, you have some lead service line sites that people decline to participate, but so you're using tier 1Bs instead of tier 1As. You would need to do this. And again, you have to do this every round or annually if you're on semi-annual monitoring. So unfortunately, this doesn't allow you to call cranky people that never want to participate once and then write them off. You have to make the attempt each time, and you have to document that you tried to get them involved, that they were offered the opportunity to be involved and to be sampled, and they declined or they didn't respond, either one. So this is the part that's really important here for you to fill out. And again, this should come in with your plan and before you monitor. Similar certification here. So this basically is your way of showing MassDEP, showing your consumers and the EPA, if needed, that you made every possible effort to get the highest tier locations, the most risky locations sampled. And this is why you can't. This is why you didn't get all high tier locations. Okay, so this might be a little bit this might be a little less familiar for some of you, especially if you were on a 3-year cycle. I don't think it was around 3 years ago. All right, we're almost there, guys. Okay, so you've done your highest tier form if needed. If there are subsequent changes to the sampling plan because of changes in plumbing, you must submit a revised sampling plan for approval. Again, it has to have the the proper reviews and signatures from someone from the system, whoever's representing the system. All right, we went over the highest tier form. It's used when you have higher tier sites available that are not willing to participate. And you definitely want to, if you're making these by letter, you want to keep copies. If you're making phone calls, keep records of those calls. A lot of people will, a lot of systems will send out letters or send out emails, and then you keep the response, or you have the lack of response, and that's your documentation that you tried. Unfortunately, when it's difficult, but you do have to contact these folks every time that you try to do this. So it's not a one and done thing. You are always, you know, people have different, you know, home ownership changes, or people's minds change about whether they want to participate. If they're higher tier and they didn't participate last time, you still have to offer them and try to recruit them again. All right, there's one other form that you might use. This is a sampling plan change form. This is for use when the original site no longer meets the criteria, for example, or someone doesn't want to do it. This is for a permanent change. This is for a permanent change, and I'll show you what this one looks like as well. You don't need to do, if you have a pre-approved alternative site that meets the criteria for use without another approval, then you can go ahead and you don't need to submit this plan. This would be for a permanent change. And usually we tell people, if you have 10 sites and you've got changes to 3 or 4 of them, just submit a new plan rather than, you know, submitting a lot of these other ones here. But I'll show you what this one looks like. Okay. Again, standard PWS information on the top. And here's your change request. So you're going to indicate what your original tier. So for example, maybe you had a tier 1A and it was a primary. You've got the address, and you've got a new permanent change to this location. Here's the important part, the reason for the change. All right, so maybe it was a full lead service line replacement, or maybe it was a whole house treatment went on, whatever the reason is, you're going to put it in here. Again, your certification, we've included your reference table here for all of your tier definitions. Okay. All right, so you're getting closer to the end here. What are you going to submit to the DEP? You're going to make sure you have signed forms of the lead and copper sampling plan A, B, and C. So that's your primary, your alternates, and your school sites. If you're submitting a plan with anything other than tier 1 sites, you're going to give us a copy of your signed material survey worksheet. Again, if necessary, you'll include your highest tier form if the highest tier sites are not on your plan. So these are your sampling instructions here. You can get online. There are separate ones for NTNCs and residential home sampling. And this we're asking for because there was a point where we had a change in the chain of custodies and the sampling instructions there was a change in terms of maximum holding times and flushing and removing aerators. That changed a couple years ago. So if you send us a copy of what you're sending out, it's just a check that you're using the most current ones. Common mistakes: incorrect spelling, out-of-date forms, avenue, street, road interchangeably for a site address. We don't, it's like me on Google Maps trying to figure out, is there really a state road and a state avenue and a state street, so we really need to make sure that that's correct. Listing sample sites that are not used for routine consumption. This is particularly, we see this more in NTNCs, janitors, closets, slop sinks, mechanical rooms. You want to be sampling that's representative, where it's representative of what people are actually drinking. So I don't know anyone who wants to fill a water bottle in a slop sink. So you want to make sure that you're actually using routine consumption sites. Forms not signed and not enclosing every form. All right, so that brings us pretty much to the end. Let's do our last poll question. See if y'all are still there. The highest tier sites form, the HTS form, it's used. Choose the best answer when all the sampling locations are tier 1. B, to document a system's attempts to use the highest tier locations when the lead and copper sampling plan does not include the highest tier locations served by the system. Or C, to permanently remove uncooperative and uninterested residents or locations from the sampling plan. So choose your best answer. Do we have any chat questions?
Yes, we do. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, quite a few. On one, I'm just going to answer right off. Any COVID questions about access, please direct them to the program director email that was sent into everyone's chat box. Okay, so it's in there, the email to the program director for the drinking water program. So any COVID questions, send there about access. Let's see. If we generate all tier 1 sites from our, whoops, moving around there, come back. Okay. From our tap cards, do we need to dig further into building permits? In other words, do they have to do any further if you have all tier 1 sites? I think we answered that one already, Kathy, right?
Yeah, if you have all tier 1 sites, you're all set.
Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean down the road you're not going to have to do a material survey site, right? Because the new regs are going to require it. So
for this year, you're
correct.
We'll see what happens after the regs come out. Yeah. Question
2 says, okay, no expectation yet we need to certify. Well, I'm not by expectation. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but you have an idea, Kathy?
Well, if you're talking about certify, if you're talking about verifying lead and copper or lead solder, there's no expectation that you search out lead solder sites.
Okay. Good.
But if
okay.
someone says to you, I think I have it, and you can send somebody out and they see that indeed it is, then it's certified, or that it's verified rather, yeah.
Okay, question 3. If we're relying on old survey information collected by a person who no longer works here, how are we supposed to sign off information that we are not 100% positive is accurate?
Well, you need to verify it yourself, or
yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. You're an operator. You better make sure that you know what you're sending in if you're going to sign it. I agree with that. Okay.
Yeah, just that so and so did it in 1992 is not much to hang your hat on. Yeah.
Okay, number 4. If a homeowner states they take a sample from a kitchen sampling plan, in other words, kitchen faucet, but they sample from the bathroom instead of the kitchen faucet, is the sample valid? In other words, a change of custody, they just change the location. It's valid.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, unless there's something like if that bathroom faucet had a filter on it.
Correct, unless there's a treatment device. So yes, definitely it would not invalidate unless there's an issue with that site. Okay. Again, we have the question on brass lines, where they fall again. Would it be a 3H or no? Is that, or am I just reading that wrong?
No, I think it would be.
Because you can't certify that as lead-free, obviously.
Right.
So I think that's where that would fall. Okay. What happens if no record of pipe material in private property? Will unknown be acceptable to be listed unknown?
Well, you're looking for a certain number of high-risk sites.
Mm-hmm. I imagine this means on the material safety data on the survey.
Yeah. So if you're choosing it as a location, it won't, I mean, you have to certify that whatever you're choosing for your chosen locations, unknown isn't going to work.
Right.
I mean, you certainly may have a lot of unknowns system-wide.
Right.
But as long as you can find high-risk sites to sample, you don't need to verify
your sample sites have to be listed as being the right, if they're all tier 1s, that's fine. Okay. Again, question on 83, 84, 85. I think you answered that one already, right, Kathy, as far as why they picked those years.
Yeah, the thought is those were the last years that were, it was legal to use the lead tin solder, and so the presumption is they would be the most likely to still be leaching.
And it was written up in the regulation originally.
And that was in 1992 or something. So
Correct.
it made more sense then than it does now.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the way it is. It's in the reg, so that's what we have to deal with. EEF include private daycare providers in a private residence.
No, those would come out as family daycares. So if you choose, if you are, if you're running that survey, that query from the the early childhood site there, that where we gave you that link, if you ask for childcare, group childcare facilities, it won't list them. If you want to look at the full list, and what I've told people is, if you have family daycares that are that fit another criteria, they're a tier 1, then absolutely you can use them. Or they're tier 1 for some other reason, but they're not, we wouldn't expect you to, because there's some cities would have hundreds of those kind of, and it would take forever to get through them all. So you're going to focus on the group childcare. But certainly if you want to, if you want to be proactive and sample them, that's great.
Remember, schools are, the different, milliliters, 250 instead of 1 liter, so they don't count in your numbers anyway for school samples.
Right.
So you have to be careful. If you're going to make it your primary sample site, now you're talking about a 1 liter sample. Anyway, so the last one, Cape Cod, during off season, is very difficult to get required number of samples. Not sure where that's something you're probably going to have to talk to your regional person about.
Yeah. That way, that might be something where in your big database, you might want to have a note if someone is a year-round resident.
Right.
Those might be, if you note those, not that they won't change, obviously, but that might help you in trying to find, to not use locations that are seasonal.
Okay, one more here, or like 2 more. Do we need a survey for each public water supply we test for samples? I think we were talking about that already, right?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think that's a material survey they're talking about.
Material survey for each system, so.
Yeah. Okay, question 12. The school website, what Tio sent the proper tool of the website for the schools. I guess there was something wrong with the website. So if you look on your chat, you'll get the right website for the early childhood schools. Question 13, LCRSPA, attach a sample site plan. Is this a map? That's what the question is.
Yes, if you can, ideally so for big systems, they often look like a distribution system with just maybe highlighted the location, highlight the locations. And for an NTNC, a lot of times it's just a facility map with the locations marked. So it's really helpful to have that.
A couple questions I wanted to cover. There was one on early childhood, a kitchen that they say had no other sample site. Would you still have to do sample sites from that? Well, if you have a kitchen, you're going to have a bathroom. So any early childhood that's a large size has a kitchen and a bathroom. So they should have 2 sample sites. And the last one was, who do we call for our lead sample plans to go over them? It is your regional person who's in charge of lead and copper, and Amy's will have a slide showing the people at the end of who to call for your region, for your sample plans. Okay?
All right. Thank you, everybody.